So I'm using the arrows. Is that the idea? Yes, yes.
Use the arrows.
Okay, all right. Okay. So, good afternoon. I bet you're really happy. I'm last, right? This is good. So, I'm going to tell you about, I give you my home site-specific opera for Guerrilla Opera Company of Boston and the Nicholas House Museum of Boston. And I collaborated on campus with some historians who then collaborated with historians elsewhere. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of stuff. The seed grant that I received from the Arts Initiative really funded activity on this project from February through April last year. But I'm going to back it up just so you see sort of like what the life of this kind of project would actually entail. So let's see. Yay. So about 5 years ago, I went to the museum as a tourist. I was really in it for the architecture and the furniture because I like house tours. And I had no idea who Rose Standish Nichols was. But she is a person who died in 1960 and left her house as a permanent museum on Beacon Hill. So not that far from Boston Common. So this particular museum really is, you know, the way she left it in 1960, pretty much. And she lived in the house all her life because she inherited it from her parents. So I found out by taking this tour that she was a suffragette, that she was a peace activist, especially around World War I, that she was a landscape architect who worked with a bunch of admittedly more famous landscape architects while she was alive. So she actually had a fairly colorful life, and seeing her stuff there, I thought it would be really cool to tell this story in this spot, in this museum, so we could actually use music to tell the story, but actually instead of have it be in the theater all the time, maybe make a version for theater, but have a version that actually would be in the museum. So I put these pictures up here so you can see in, say, 1920, what the outside of the house would look like. And what we were sort of experiencing, this is actually a current photo from their website, but we were working in there in June and July, and we were mostly masked most of the time. So we had a very tiny opera company and a very tiny audiences that would follow us around the house, performing in this space. So it was it really had to be a site-specific opera. Because of that limitation, I actually pitched to a very specific opera company in Boston, the Guerrilla Opera Company, because number one, they only do new work. They're a 21st century company. They sing and play 21st century music. And they are willing to do things that are, let's say, out of the box. And they are willing to do things that might be quite small. And with the pandemic ongoing, this was actually a big selling point, right? We're going to actually move from room to room, so we can't have loads and loads of people. What we can have is maybe 3 people. And what you see down there is a photo of the Guerrilla people involved in this project when they played at Minsky Recital Hall on campus. Is this too loud? We're fine? Okay. So my pitch to them was, what if Elizabeth Warren, but in 1910? And what venues would she have for her life? Would she try all of them? Would she pick one? Would she sort of be an activist and only that? Or would she be a landscape architect and only that? Would she be a painter? Would she get married? What kind of things would she actually choose to do? What would be her available choices, given where she's growing up in upper middle class, kind of slightly fancy Bostonian neighborhood? So they were very interested in that because it wasn't a story about someone who succeeded at everything. She had, let's say, an average batting average. She got a lot of jobs as a landscape architect. She worked with the suffragettes very regularly. She didn't have so much success as a peace activist, and some of that stuff went into the show. So it took a long time. I said, you know, I went to the museum about 5 years ago. I talked to Guerrilla Opera probably 4 years ago, and then we started the process of building the spec. So most of the libretto, I worked on a draft, and then we actually had a workshop. When you actually pitch an opera company, you wind up having lots of workshops over time. So we actually workshop the libretto with the director and their dramaturg. And we did things like, I was pitching this aria about how not to make a flower garden, which was an article that Rose actually wrote in a magazine, sort of like House Beautiful of the time. And she described the first time she tried to actually design a garden, which was for her family in New Hampshire, at their summer place. And she will tell you in the article that it failed because some of the things that she chose to put in the garden were wrong for the soil. So some things worked and some things didn't. And you see here that I've got part of what we call the score of that particular aria up there. So you see that there's a line for Rose, there's a line for the alto saxophone player, and there's a line for the group vibraphone. So because I only have those instruments, right, a few percussion instruments, saxophone and soprano, so they can move around the space, that's what we're working with. So we had a libretto workshop, we had a workshop of just the first pass on the musical score in December last year, and then we were getting ready to come to UMaine. Actually, sorry, one more step. Around right before coming to UMaine, we actually made some sample recordings in the Nichols Museum just to see what it would be like to have just two people being, you know, sort of performing in these relatively small rooms, where the audiences are going to be, all that kind of stuff. We made sample recordings in part for grant applications in the Boston area for the stuff after April. So the stuff that would actually be the public performances. I'm not going to play that. On campus, I worked with Cara Perucchio because she had a specialty. Obviously, she works in the history and the women's gender and sexuality studies program. She has a specialty in talking about women and their relationship to various cultures, women and their relationships to storytelling, and just sort of general sort of presentation of women's lives. So she actually wrote a historical essay that went in the program for the concert version of the show that we actually did, which you saw the photo of, in March at UMaine. So she did that, but she also contacted her colleague, Mona Siegel, from Sacramento State, and Mona actually made a video for us that was basically a sort of short introduction to Rose Standish Nichols and her time. So you can see that she did a Zoom thing with an introduction to the feminist pacifist activism of Rose Standish Nichols, which is going to become important in a little bit. So all this stuff is happening before the actual performance that you made. Then we have the performance that you made. In addition to the performance itself, there was also a series of master classes that the performers actually worked with performing arts students at the School of Performing Arts. So they actually worked with student performers. We did recording sessions. So most of the time they were actually quite busy. They were either recording or performing or having master classes. After the master class, Mona Siegel came. And she gave a talk that was related. She wanted to compare sort of European, more pacifist suffragette people with people from Asia who are perhaps not so pacifist and were working for women's rights in a more warrior type way. So she came and actually gave a live talk here for historians and for people in the WGS program and so that was sort of the post workshop UMaine experience. Then we had the public performances. So in June, we had 5 shows. Aliana, the main singer, said it was okay for her to do 2 40-minute shows where she was basically singing all the time per day. And that was, she could do that. So we did 1 show on Friday, we did 2 shows Saturday and 2 shows Sunday. Why we do so many shows? Because with the room so small, you could really only have 20 people at a time come see the thing. So that's what we did for 1 weekend in June. And you can sort of see here that there's some photos from the dress rehearsal. So you can see some of the architecture behind them. You'll also notice that we decided, unlike the sample recordings that we made for the grant procedures in Boston, we didn't have Aliana actually do period dress for these performances. We made that decision in part to make her a little bit more relatable, and a little bit less distant from people actually watching the show. So we actually chose white suffragette, which has become sort of a thing, right? Especially with the anniversary of the suffragette movement just recently passed. So what you see here is performers along with Aliana. Sometimes we had people portray her mother. Sometimes it was just Aliana singing to the small audience. So I'm going to actually play you some music. And I want to set it up by saying this is part of the aria I mentioned that talked about her first garden, the one that failed. So I chose this one in part because it's sort of right in the middle of the show, of a 40-minute show. It sort of represents her deal, right? She doesn't always succeed. She has very few wins in her column. One of the other scenes actually includes the letter that Woodrow Wilson wrote to her saying, no, you don't have to come to the Treaty of Versailles hearings because we don't need a representative from the Women's Peace Party. Thanks, anyway. So that's part of the show. This part, she's actually taking things that she sees as verging on failure, but trying to sort of think about what was the good part? Where were her successes? What can she take away from this? So you're going to see that the libretto is over there. I don't know if you can see, but this is her design for her first garden. It's very formal. She was all about formality. So at least in garden design. So I'm going to just play this for you, and I hope this actually goes.
But the structure was good, the architecture and the colors against the gray stone and the view of Mount Scottney. And when seen from a safe distance, from the piazza, its deficiencies are lost in space. German iris, yellow lilies, asters, though some of it had to be grassed over. And when seen from a safe distance, from the piazza, its deficiencies are lost in space. German iris, yellow lilies, purple asters, hardy perennials, no roses or peonies or dahlias in this large but peaceful garden.
So after the show, we actually sort of got a little bit of attention from some of our funders from the Boston aspect of the production. So Opera America, which is sort of the major service organization for opera in this country, sort of used a photo of Aliana as Rose as part of their regular publication. So we got funding from the Boston Foundation Lab project, and we got funding from Opera America to help us with the Boston production in particular. So this would be after the UMaine portion of the project. And it's not over, because what we did while we actually rehearsed in the house for the June stuff, we actually in June and July filmed. And we didn't just film in the house. You can sort of see Aliana's there, obviously not in the house. She's actually in Cornish, New Hampshire, where the first garden actually was. One of the things that I didn't mention just yet is that Rose was related to Augustus St. Gaudens. So she was quite in that sort of Cornish, New Hampshire artist colony scene. And that's one of the reasons that she sort of wanted to make an impression on those people, was to really become a garden architect, in her own words. So we filmed in New Hampshire, we filmed in Vermont, we filmed in some of the gardens around Boston. And that film is being edited now. The recordings that we made at UMaine are actually going to be simultaneously released with the movie, we hope, in March 2023. We just finished editing the CD tracks, and now the movie has to actually match them, which will be interesting. So that's where I am. All right, thank you.